Welcome to This Dementia Life, created by Dementia Action Alliance. Our website is daanow.org. I am proud to be your host, Chuck McClatchy. I live my dementia life with Alzheimer's disease. During this Dementia Life podcast, we will have conversations with inspiring people living with dementia and the amazing people that care about us. My guest today is Dr. Peter Reed. He's a PhD, and he is the director of the Sanford Center for Aging at the University of Nevada, Reno. And when you read his resume, he has worked his entire life for people with dementia. So, Dr. Reed, why don't you go ahead and kind of introduce yourself and what put you on this path that you've just worked so hard on?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Chuck. And I want to thank the Dementia Action Alliance for this opportunity to just share a little bit about myself and my work. I'm thrilled to be here. And so how did I get put on this path? Well, it's interesting. I think it really started when I was in college. I was at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. And at that time, I had a grandfather who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And he lived in a different part of the state. And I really wasn't able to visit him as much as I would have liked. But I was very curious about what was kind of going on with him and his experiences. And so I wanted to learn more about Alzheimer's and dementia. And it was actually my mother that introduced me then to a woman by the name of Virginia Bell. And Virginia Bell had worked with David Troxel to develop and launch a program and really an approach to supporting people living with dementia called the Best Friends approach. And so as a 21-year-old, I was able, during my experience there in college, to go and become a volunteer at the Best Friends program. And so it's an adult day support program. And my job title was to be a best friend. And I would go, actually that first summer, I went every day, Monday through Saturday, and spent all day with my best friend, basically just having fun. She was a person who was living with dementia. Her name was Helen. And we took walks and we read books and we played music, and she loved to dance. And I would play my guitar, and it was very much of a social engagement kind of model and kind of approach. And what's interesting is, when I reflect back on it now, I didn't realize it at the time, but when I reflect back on it now, and it's been, over 25 years ago, it's striking that my first role in the field really was very relational. It was built around my relationship with this person in what was truly a mutually beneficial dynamic. I mean, we just spent time together and had fun together. And so, it wasn't grounded in kind of a deficits-based approach to Alzheimer's or focusing on what she couldn't do any longer, but really focusing on those retained strengths. And as I said, I didn't recognize that at the time. But just looking back, it I think gave me the right introduction into the world of dementia care and supports in a way that lets me really recognize the retained personhood and the opportunities to help people live their best life. And so that has been something that has been kind of a learning process for me over time, and the journey that I've been on and the other different experiences that I had. I would say actually that after that, I did have two other grandmothers that also were diagnosed with different forms of dementia. And so I was able, really, as I was going through school, both finishing up at the University of Kentucky and then going to the University of North Carolina for graduate school, during those years that I was kind of learning from an academic perspective about public health and aging and dementia, I was witnessing firsthand the experiences of my grandparents and the variety of different settings that they were in, both within the community and then when they transitioned in some cases into assisted living communities or transitioned into skilled nursing homes. And it struck me even back then, that there was a lot of work that needed to be done to help to build more supportive environments for people to live and be themselves. And so then that became really the foundation for the research that I did in my doctoral program at the university. I worked with two great mentors, Dr. Phil Sloan and Cheryl Zimmerman. And they were leading a project really to analyze the quality of care that was being offered within assisted living and skilled nursing communities, and what approaches to care would result in higher quality of life. And so that was really the research that I focused on. This is a long answer to a simple question, but it's my journey, right? And so then I transitioned from the University of North Carolina into my first, quote, real job when I was hired by the Alzheimer's Association at their national headquarters in Chicago. And my role essentially in that first position there within the Alzheimer's Association was to translate the research that I'd been doing at the university alongside a wide breadth of other research into a national campaign to provide education and training and policy changes to help to improve the quality of care in long-term care communities. And then I had lots of other experiences while I was at the association as well. And then moved on from the association to lead a public health research center and continued to be involved in the world of Alzheimer's and dementia, really at that time as a board member for the Northern California and Northern Nevada chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. But then when I left that Health Policy Research Center, I went and became the CEO of an organization called the Pioneer Network. And the Pioneer Network is an international nonprofit dedicated to radically transforming the culture of aging, and had a very strong emphasis on advocacy and training resources to support people living with dementia. And I like to say that's kind of where I became radicalized and sort of started to break down some of those prior notions and prior understandings really grounded in deficits, and started to get enlightened into this idea of enabling that there are opportunities to enable people to live well with dementia. And then that really has carried forward into my current role at the Sanford Center for Aging, and my work currently as the chair of the state task force on dementia, and the work that we're doing to try and ensure that here in Nevada, people living with dementia have all of the supports and resources they need to live in the manner that they choose to live. So that's my career journey, if you will. But as you can imagine, there have been a lot of life lessons along the way that have really kind of shaped not only what I've done in my profession, but really kind of shaped me as a person as well.
I do have one question. You don't have the typical outlook of a researcher or a doctor or people that normally deal with it in a medical field. How have you felt working with the establishment and the myths and the misunderstandings and all of this towards people with dementia? Have you met resistance?
So I should clarify, and you mentioned this in the beginning, but I am not a physician. My background is in public health. And so my training really was around understanding how to develop and deliver high quality community-based programs to enable health and well-being. And so in addition to my focus on Alzheimer's disease and dementia, there's that context in which I'm working. Now, where that intersects with the medical field and kind of the different perspectives and opinions with dementia, or where that runs up against those perspectives, I've tried to remain diplomatic. I mean, I have seen my role as being one of an advocate and a resource, kind of with the understanding that nobody knows what they know until they know it. So I never judge. If people are coming from a different paradigm, or they're maybe not using the language that I would like to hear when we're discussing these kinds of concepts, I try not to judge, and I try not to be critical. I try to help kind of educate and bring people along so that they can develop their own new understanding. And so, I've worked on projects to develop for example, physician education initiatives to teach them about Alzheimer's and dementia. I've developed education and training programs for long-term care professionals. I've developed programs for aging services professionals. And there's always a thread that is woven through those. From a clinical side, we try to talk about being person-centered or patient-centered, which is really using individualized approaches to understand everything that there is to understand about a person, and then developing systems of support to help them succeed in meeting their own goals. But even that language becomes challenging when you start to think about the importance of relationships and the interactivity that takes place between a person really with any condition or an elder with any condition and the folks that are there to help to support them and to offer resources. I think, though, that I want to mention another kind of enlightening moment for me, and that was to the recognition that there's a whole world of people who are living with dementia who can advocate for themselves and who can be engaged in discussions and conversations. And that recognition really took place when I was working at the National Alzheimer's Association. So during my first couple of years when I worked there, I was really focused on developing training programs for long-term care providers to improve quality, and in developing and delivering services for what we call the caregivers of people who are living with dementia. And about halfway through my 5 years at the association, or a couple years into it, there was an initiative that was launched. I was asked, actually, there were some advocates in the field that had reached out and encouraged the CEO at that time, Harry Johns, to really start to have the association put more emphasis and more energy into directly engaging with people who were living with dementia. And so he asked me to develop and launch a way to do that. And so what came out of that was called, at that time, the Early Stage Initiative. And one of the things we learned very early on was that we needed to learn more about what the experience was like for people who were living with dementia, who were advocating for themselves, many who were living alone and caring for themselves, and many who retained a lot of capacity really just to engage, which goes back to those myths that you were talking about, right? There's a myth that people living with dementia, have lost a lot of their capabilities. And in all honesty, I struggled at first, because at that time I had, a 94-year-old grandmother who was living in a nursing home and had lost weight and weighed about 60 pounds and was just really at the end of life. And so that was the picture that I had in my head of the kinds of people that we were supporting. And then to see these advocates come forward to say, we're having this experience as well, was challenging, because you have to recognize that the lived experience of Alzheimer's and dementia can last 20 or more years. So think about someone who's 80 years old, right? Who maybe is at the end of their experience with dementia, and they've had it for 20 years. They've been living with these changes. That's a quarter of their life in this lived experience of dementia. And to treat them as anything other than living community members who have every right and responsibility of other community members is a disservice to their personhood. But it's tough in the soundbite world that we live in to paint an accurate picture of somebody who, is at the very beginning of the experience with Alzheimer's, and somebody who's at the end of the experience with Alzheimer's, and everything in between, and the stories and kind of the opportunities that people have at all stages and all phases. I don't even like to talk about stages, because ultimately that does, again, a disservice to the individuals, because it's about that lived experience of the individual. And maybe from a professional perspective, stages kind of give us a framework by which to categorize and come up with generalities, but that neglects the fact that each individual is different. Each individual has their own resources, their own limitations, their own strengths as a person, their own constraints in their context and their environment and their resources. So it's a very complicated picture. But getting back to my story, so when we launched that early stage initiative, we knew we needed to learn more. And so we hosted a series of town hall meetings all over the country, really inviting people living with dementia to come forward and tell us their stories. And the first thing I will say is that it was really tough to get their family members to sit down and shut up because they wanted to speak on behalf of their loved one, right? And then that tendency is there. But then once we overcame that hurdle, we heard so much from people living with dementia directly. That was back in 2005. It's about 15 years ago. And what struck me was that when you hear people share their experience, share their lived experience in what it's like to live with dementia, they were not complaining about the functional challenges that they were experiencing. They were not saying, oh, well, dementia keeps me from doing this or dementia keeps me from doing that. They were saying, they talked about the challenges that they had during the diagnostic experience and getting an accurate diagnosis and getting the providers to communicate with them about what was going on and what resources were available. They complained about the stigma and the fear and the negativity and kind of what I have come in later years to describe as a tragedy discourse of dementia that were grounded in this negative paradigm. And they talked about how they wanted to advocate for change, that they wanted to be engaged, they wanted to be, respected and understood for where they were in life, and that it was a perfectly valid life experience, a perfectly valid place in the life course, and that they should be enabled to live the life that they choose despite the challenges that come along with living with dementia.
I have to say, I am a product of that initiative that you started. I was on the 2016 National Early Stage Advisory Group, and that really changed my life forever. I talked to a few caregiver conferences and things like this, but never on the national level until I was there. And the satisfaction that I got and the reaction that I got when I would make these talks was inspiring to me, because people were saying, well, how can you do this? Are you, do you really have Alzheimer's? And that whole thing came up. The next question I want to ask you, one of the big issues that you've already talked about a little bit is care partners. And, the care partner actually giving space to the individual to succeed and not do all of the wrong things for the right reason, and put them in their little protective cocoon and protect them from anything is out there. Has that been hard to kind of get through sometimes?
Again, like everything in this world, it's a complicated question, right? Because this is not something that people in the general public, it's not an experience. Living with dementia and how to support somebody living with dementia is not something that people in the general public are well educated on in their everyday lives, right? It's something that people come to when it's thrust upon them, right? And so there's a tendency with big-hearted, loving family members, they really want to keep their loved one safe. And they've heard all of the negative imagery or seen the negative imagery and heard the negative stories, and they're grounded in kind of this tragedy-focused narrative that is so dominant in our culture about people who are living with dementia. And so therefore they feel like it is their responsibility to step up and take care of that person. And in some ways, that's very true, right? It is true that there are times when people need support. And particularly over the years, as someone's needs change, family members really do need to be a supportive, helpful force. The challenge is balancing, and it's a struggle, right? It's balancing autonomy with care and support, or physical needs and physical safety. And you don't want to provide too much support to somebody in a way that creates learned dependency, so that, people start to check out and start to do less and less for themselves, even if they were able to do it in the first place, simply because it's being done for them. And my wife, Dr. Jennifer Carson, is a brilliant person in this field as well, who I respect very much. And in her work, she kind of turned me on to the phrase in this, which is that it really is functioning out of benevolent paternalism. That people have good intentions and they're coming from a good place. And so they want to be helpful, right? But a lot of times that ends up taking away opportunities for people to do for themselves because it's paternalistic. So it's coming from a good place, but it's still paternalism, and it's still depriving people of the right to be themselves and to make decisions for themselves and to care for themselves to the extent possible. Now, as I said, though, the general public is not well educated on these issues. So I really am an advocate for developing resources and education that uses the right approach and the right messages and the right content to help people grow in their understanding. Circling back to your question about how I engage kind of with the medical community, right? It's without judgment. And the same is true for family members and loved ones and friends of people living with dementia. I don't judge where they're coming from or what their perspectives are, because A, I don't understand what their life is really like and the challenges that they may be experiencing. B, I don't know enough about the person that they're supporting to understand what the strengths are of that person or what some of their limitations might be. And so there's a uniqueness to each experience that makes it really, really difficult. But I do think that there are ways to give people education and information and resources and tools to help them kind of see it in a little bit different light and to be more successful in the work that they're doing, so they can do everything possible to maintain a normalcy in everyday life and to maximize people's retained abilities. But it changes very fast, or it can. And it changes day to day. So it's a tough issue, but I think everybody's heart is in the right place, or at least that's my hope. Maybe I'm naive.
No, I think you're right. They are. It's funny because the first time I was asked to speak at a caregiver conference, what went through my mind was, what are you going to tell these people? They're living it. You can get information from them. And then after I did my talk, there must have been 25 people that lined up to talk to me. And that's when I first kind of realized that it's not a talked about disease. And that's when, that helped me trying to put my face out there, because I want people to see what people with dementia have the ability to do. To talk to those care partners they do all the wrong things for the right reason. And you can't confront them about that because they do it out of love. But to show them that there are other avenues, and as long as you put somebody in a position to succeed and help them, who knows what they're up to. And the way that you've done it is amazing. Well,
if I could just say, I don't mean to jump in. I just want to emphasize something that I said that I think is important, is that when you're working with families and with people living with dementia, it's just really important not to judge. It's really important to accept them for where they are, and then approach the entire interaction with a goal of really trying to help people grow in their understanding and to help them along their journey. And everybody's journey is different. And it's not to say that I know what you should know. It's to say that we could explore these things together and find what works best for you. But I think it's incumbent upon everyone to accept that we don't fully understand everything that's necessary, and that we're open. We're entering with an open-mindedness that's going to help everybody grow together.
That's so true. And, I'm lucky to work with your wife on the Dementia Conversations. And just by talking with people on their level, the interest that we have and the people that we have, are asking questions about what we just talked about. How do I rein him in, or how do I give him more autonomy? And it's nice that at least people are starting to talk about it. And it's because of, individuals like you and your wife that have dedicated their lives to this. And I've seen you before, and what you do is just, to me, is heartfelt. And I just wanted to thank you for all the things that you do for us. And my last question, I always ask this to everybody. If this podcast was the first one that either somebody diagnosed with dementia or a care partner saw, what would you like them to know?
That's a great question. And I think, for someone who's just been diagnosed with dementia, or for a care partner who's supporting someone who's just been diagnosed with dementia, my advice, for what it's worth, would be not to let dementia define anyone's life. That there are many, many, many different diseases. There are many, many, many different conditions that create challenges in people's lives. There's all kinds of adversity, which, by the way, can occur at any age. And I would hope that they could recognize that dementia is just another form of adversity that can enter into people's lives. And just like any other form of adversity, there are ways to address it, ways to overcome it, ways to live well despite it. And that if you get stuck in the tragedy narrative and you let the disease define someone's life, then you're medicalizing their everyday life. And there are very few moments in that medicalized everyday life where you're actually providing any kind of medical treatment for the disease of Alzheimer's or dementia. It is a lived experience as much as it's a medical condition. And so if you over-medicalize it and just focus on the disease as now defining someone's life, then you're depriving them of the entire rest of their life and the human connectedness and the social engagement opportunities and, anything that anybody enjoys or likes to do. Focus on what can still be done, what is retained, and not what is lost. And don't medicalize somebody's life simply because they have a particular diagnosis. The diagnosis does not define anyone. I have diagnoses in my life. They don't define who I am. We just seem to live in such a hypercognitive world that when cognitive changes occur, somehow it becomes, existential, when that probably is an exaggeration of the impact that it has on many people living in our communities today.
Well, Dr. Reed, thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're busy, and I really hope that people will watch this because, you had on a lot of very good, honest answers that, and people are looking for that kind of information. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Chuck. I am so grateful to you for hosting these conversations and for making them available to others. And I hope that what I've had to share today has been helpful to someone, and wish you the best of luck with your podcast moving forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dementia Action Alliance for their support. On behalf of This Dementia Life, I would thank you for joining us today. You can view other podcasts on our website, danow.org. Click on podcast. Please join us again to meet the most inspiring and amazing people on This Dementia Life. I'm your host, Chuck McClatchy, and remember, the brain may forget, but the heart remembers. See you next time on This Dementia Life.